Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland, and here I'm in London in front of the statue of Robert Burns. It's got a quotation from him there saying how his homeland imbued him with this inspiration for poetry. So who was Robert Burns? Well, he was born in Ayrshire, Scotland in 1759. He grew up in a farming family of modest means, and he had just a primary schooling. So not many people went to secondary school, and almost nobody went to university. So he worked on the family farm for a while, and he did various other jobs. Although he was very fond of whiskey, he later worked as an excise agent, because one of the key revenue streams of the government at the time was taxing alcohol production. There were a lot of illegal whiskey stills, people making it for private consumption but also for sale. So he was fond of the juice of the barley. It was one of the few decent salary jobs a person could get. Was being an excise agent. Such a person had to be literate, and it being the 18th century, a lot of people hadn't been to school at all. So he was never a wealthy man. At one time he considered moving to the West Indies, where he was offered an administrative post there. So he was a working man's poet, and he collected folklore, popular rhymes of the time. He sometimes polished them up and then had them published. So his work wasn't entirely original. Some of his verses were completely original, but he made no pretense that all his poems were entirely his own work. And sometimes it's difficult to tell what was original and what were simply things that he'd reworked. So I'm just trying to think of some of his best known poems. There's a long narrative one called Tam O'Shanter, about a haunting, and there's the Tam O'Shanter hat, which takes its name from that poem. There's the one about Bruce before Bannockburn, Scots were hay with Wallace bled. What else does he do? Yeah, so he often writes in Scots dialect, as in not using the vowel one would find in standard English, non-canonical grammar and so on. Address to a Haggis is one of his most celebrated poems. Fair for your honest sonsy face, great chieftain o' the Podden race, and so on. So haggis was considered poor man's fare. It's the least delectable parts of a sheep. Apparently it's originally Greek. Anyway, you eat it with neeps and tatties, as in turnips and potatoes. There in this poem he was saying, though this might be considered to be a poor person's dinner, in fact it is delicious, and we should honour it more than the most sumptuous feast. And that's given rise to Burns Night, which is his birthday, the 30th of January, if memory serves. So every 30th of January he's celebrated as the national poet of Scotland, and people will eat haggis. Now many people who are not Scots profess to find it revolting. I'm not Scots, but I find it tasty, so long as it's not too spicy. There's more than one way to make it. And so on Burns Night, the haggis will be piped in, as in a bagpipe will be playing it as it's brought in on a platter. People will eat it with potatoes and turnips. Turnips in countries such as Romania used to feed pigs, not people. What else? There'll be some drams of whiskey drunk as well. So he was brought up in the Church of Scotland. He wasn't a particularly religious person, and a lot of the ministers of the Church of Scotland were decidedly dour and puritanical, disapproved of drinking whiskey, dancing, things of that nature. But he was a jolly sort of person. He wrote many bawdy ballads like Ye Jovial Boys Who Love the Joys and so on. There's a pub in the Edinburgh Grassmarket that he used to frequent. So he was a poet of the common people, as I said. Now, many poor poets and artists got themselves wealthy patrons. These patrons of the arts would then employ these poets to write verses in their praise. But he was not going to appease the vanity of a wealthy man. So he didn't compose any paeans to the high and mighty. So he could have lived rather better if he'd done that. So he did not die a wealthy man. He was in love with Jean Armour. What other notable things about him? The house he lived in Ayrshire still stands. So that is Robert Burns, honoured here at the Embankment Gardens in London, though I believe he never visited London. I'm not sure he even ever left Scotland, so don't let it be said that England is Caledonophobic, because, as I say, despite him never having set foot in England, he is still exalted here with his splendid and handsome statue, and there an inscription on the granite plinth, where he speaks of how splendid Scotland is and how that moved him to compose these immortal verses.